The Imitator? Ben had never been afraid of his own voice, until it started talking back. It began as faint echoes he thought he'd imagined. Once, while brushing his teeth, he muttered to himself, "Need to grab a jacket," only to hear his own voice, low and slow, murmur back, "Yeah, grab a jacket." The bathroom was empty, the door closed, but the voice lingered, soft, almost mocking. He shrugged it off, convinced it was his mind playing tricks. But then it happened again and again. Late one night, while reaching for his phone on his bed, he mumbled, "Where'd I put it?" And from somewhere in his empty room, he heard himself say, "Right there, beside you." The voice was nearly identical to his, but off, like a recording that had warped over time. He froze, heart racing, his fingers brushing his phone where it lay beside him. For minutes, he stayed motionless, listening, but heard nothing else. Convincing himself it was just his imagination, he forced himself to ignore it. But soon, it got worse. It began to respond every time he spoke to himself. Whether he was alone in his car or lying in bed, he'd hear faint, delayed responses. Always his own voice, but with a strange, almost predatory edge. His voice had always been warm and familiar, but this one was cold, drawn out in a way that made his skin prickle. One night he decided to test it. Sitting alone in his room, with the lights off, he whispered, "Are you there?" For a long moment, only silence answered. But just as he relaxed, thinking he'd imagined it, the voice returned, barely louder than a breath. "Yes, Ben, I'm here." Ben's blood ran cold. He felt an overwhelming urge to get out of the room, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he gritted his teeth and forced himself to ask, "Who are you?" The voice took its time responding. "I'm you." The words slid out slowly, as if savoring each syllable. "But I'm also not you." Shivers prickled down his spine. He gripped the edge of his bed, trying to convince himself this was all in his head. But the voice continued, soft, mocking, a whisper only he could hear. "I know everything about you, Ben, every thought, every fear. I know what keeps you awake at night." He shut his eyes, pressing his hands over his ears, but he could still hear it, like it was crawling through his skull. The voice, his own voice, laughed, a low, sinister chuckle that sent icy chills through him. "I'm inside you, Ben," it said, each word stretching out like a taunt, "and I'm getting closer." For days after, he was too terrified to speak, too afraid to let his voice slip out even in a mutter. But it didn't stop the thing. Even in silence, it started to make itself known in other ways. Sometimes, as he lay in bed, he'd hear his own voice humming softly from the other side of the room, as if it was moving around, lurking in the dark. Other times, he'd hear it laugh, a dry, mocking sound that filled the silence. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he made the mistake of muttering under his breath, "Just leave me alone." A heartbeat later, his voice responded from somewhere close, too close. "But I like it here." The voice was right beside his ear, a soft murmur that sent chills down his spine. He could feel its breath on his neck, a sensation as real as any human touch. He jerked away, heart pounding, and fled to the other side of the room, gasping for air. But the thing didn't stop. Soon, it began speaking to him without waiting for him to say anything at all. It would taunt him, remind him of things he wanted to forget, every regret, every fear, every horrible memory he'd buried. It would bring them up, whispering them in his own voice, forcing him to relive every awful moment. "Remember when you thought you were safe?" it sneered one night. "When you believed you were alone?" He pressed his hands over his ears, trembling, but the voice just grew louder, drilling into his mind. It knew things he'd never told anyone, memories he hadn't even remembered himself. Then one night, as he lay shivering under his blankets, trying to block out the voice, it did something new. He heard his own footsteps. He knew he hadn't moved. He was huddled on his bed, staring at his closed bedroom door. But from somewhere outside his room, he heard his own footsteps, soft and slow, padding down the hall. "Come out, Ben," it called, his own voice dripping with a mocking sweetness. "Come say hello?" He held his breath, heart hammering, as the footsteps came closer, each one measured, deliberate, closing in on his door. The knob jiggled, and he heard his own voice chuckle from the other side, a dark, gleeful sound. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone and dialed his friend Mark, desperate for someone to anchor him to reality. The ringing echoed in the silence, each tone stretching longer and longer until he thought he'd lose his mind. Finally, Mark picked up. "Ben, dude, it's late. What's wrong?" The relief was overwhelming, grounding him in the real world. "Mark, something's in my apartment. It's It's using my voice. Mark went quiet for a second. Ben, are you sure you're not just tired? I mean, we can talk, but... The voice cut him off, laughing low and dark from the other side of his door. You think Mark can save you? Ben's heart dropped as he heard his own voice speak through the phone. Mark, the voice said, as sweet and normal as his own. It's okay. I'm fine, just a little freaked out. His own voice was lying to his friend. He tried to shout, to scream into the phone, but no sound came out. His throat was tight. The words stuck, like something was forcing him silent. Mark hesitated, then sighed. Okay. Call me if you need anything, all right? The line went dead. Ben dropped the phone, hands trembling, and turned toward his door, where the thing was still laughing, the sound shifting, distorting, until it barely resembled his voice anymore. It was guttural, twisted, like a wild animal imitating a human. Slowly, he saw the door begin to open, inch by inch. He backed up, pressing himself against the far wall, heart hammering as his own face appeared, peering around the edge of the doorframe. But it wasn't really his face. The eyes were too wide, the grin stretched too far, revealing too many teeth. It stepped into his room, each movement jerky, unnatural, like it was getting used to controlling his body. Thank you for letting me in, it said, voice scraping and low, twisting his own words. Ben tried to scream, but the thing just grinned wider, inching closer, filling his vision until all he could see was his own distorted face, twisted with malice. That was the last time anyone saw Ben. In the days after, his friends noticed he'd changed. His laugh sounded wrong. His expression seemed forced, as though he was imitating emotions he didn't understand. And sometimes when he thought no one was looking, his face would fall blank, his mouth curling into a smile that was far too wide, his eyes watching them with a hunger they couldn't understand. And every so often, in an empty room, if you listened closely, you could hear Ben's voice calling out, begging, from somewhere deep inside.